somewhere along the Mississippi River, in a Louisiana parish whose real name has been deliberately erased from official records. There once stood a plantation where 17 men died in ways so disturbing that, in 1847, the authorities ordered every document connected to the case burned. What makes this story truly unsettling isn't the number of deaths, but one repeated detail found in every surviving witness account. Each man was discovered clutching a small piece of indigo-dyed cloth, his eyes wide open as if frozen in the moment of seeing something unspeakable, and on his lips the same whispered name. The woman behind that name appeared in old plantation ledgers as the most sought-after property in the entire Mississippi Delta, yet no complete bill of sale for her has ever been recovered. For more than a century and a half, her story has been carefully scrubbed from Louisiana's official history and survived only in fragments, torn diary pages, coded letters between planters, and testimonies that were sealed by court order until 1952. What happened on that unnamed plantation is not a ghost story, but the record of a woman who understood exactly how to turn men's desires into weapons and how to use their obsessions to engineer their own destruction. Before we go deeper into what later came to be whispered as the Indigo Terror, imagine the world she moved through. The Mississippi Delta in 1839 was a place of brutal contradictions, gleaming white-columned mansions rising out of swampland, framed by cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, the air thick with the sweet, heavy smell of sugarcane and cotton, crops that generated fortunes measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. And beneath that wealth, the reality that every dollar was built on the bent backs of enslaved people working from first light until darkness swallowed the fields. In the parish we'll call St. Landry, though that was not its true name, there were 47 major plantations, each operating like a small kingdom with almost absolute power vested in a single owner. These men, mostly French Creole families whose land holdings predated the Louisiana Purchase, competed viciously with each other in everything that could signal status: who produced the largest crop, who built the grandest house, who owned the finest horses and, most grotesquely, who possessed the most beautiful human beings. Beneath the polite rituals of church, dinners, and balls, there existed an underground market that everyone pretended not to see in daylight but eagerly participated in after dark. Certain enslaved women, those judged exceptionally beautiful by the standards of the time, became objects of secret competition among wealthy planters. They were traded, gifted, and even quietly fought over in ways that plantation ledgers carefully avoided describing. In their private correspondence, planters developed a code language to talk about them. It was into this world that, in the spring of 1839, a woman arrived whose surviving descriptions sound almost deliberately crafted to torment the men who encountered her. She was brought into the parish by a cotton broker named Lysander Thibault, a man infamous for acquiring rare and valuable human property for the richest planters in Louisiana. In his personal journal, he referred to her only as the Gautier acquisition, and recorded that he had purchased her from a declining estate in Charleston, South Carolina, for the staggering sum of $3,000, more than 3 times the price of a skilled male field hand. Thibault described her as tall, with skin the color of burnished copper, classical features, and eyes of such penetrating intelligence that even hardened overseers felt uneasy under her gaze. But it was one particular line that should have been read as a warning. He wrote that she possessed a stillness that seems almost unnatural, as though she is always watching, always calculating, and admitted that she unsettled him, though he could not explain why. At 26, she was unusually old for the specific trade she was being drawn into. Most enslaved women, commodified this way, were teenagers or in their early 20s. Her age hinted at a longer, more complicated history than any of the men around her bothered to imagine. Thibault planned to sell her at a small private auction to 5 of the wealthiest planters in the parish. But on the night before the auction, something happened that would set in motion a chain of events none of them could control. Sometime between midnight and dawn, The woman vanished from the locked room where Thibault kept her in a boarding house in Opelousas. The parish sheet. The door was still locked from the outside. The barred window showed no sign of tampering. Yet the room was empty. All that remained was a torn piece of indigo cloth from her dress, and a lingering scent that witnesses later compared to oleander flowers, floral and faintly poisonous. The entire parish erupted into frantic searches. Slave patrols scoured the swamps, river banks, and back roads. Rewards were posted. Rumors spread that she had help from abolitionists, or that she had drowned in the bayous, or that she was hiding in the slave quarters of some rival's plantation. For 3 days there was no trace of her. Then the story took its first impossible turn. In broad daylight, with no attempt at concealment, the woman walked calmly up the oak-lined drive of one of the largest plantations in the parish, the estate of Sebastien Duval, a 43-year-old widower and one of the most powerful planters in Louisiana. Owned more than 200 enslaved people and 3,000 acres of prime sugarcane land. He was known for his icy business sense and his hunger for social dominance, and he was one of the 5 men invited to bid at Thibault's private auction. When his staff stopped the woman and demanded to know why she was there, she gave an answer that should have shaken the foundations of the world she lived in. She said simply, "I chose you," in a system built entirely on the idea that enslaved people had no choices at all. Those 3 words were a quiet act of rebellion. Duval did not treat them as a warning. Instead, he took them as flattery. He immediately paid Thibault his original asking price, $6,000, and claimed her as his property. Within a week, she was no longer sleeping in the slave quarters, but installed in a small cottage on the grounds, a building that had once housed his late wife's maid. She was given fine clothing, her own servant, and was seen walking for hours in the gardens with Duval at her side, speaking softly while the rest of the household pretended not to stare. The scandal spread through plantation society with the speed of fire. White women whispered behind their fans. Other planters watched with a mixture of envy and disgust. Duval's own relatives wrote desperate letters worrying about his judgment. But Duval ignored them all, seemingly locked in an almost trance-like infatuation. What none of them understood, not yet, was that this was not the story of a man falling in love with a woman he believed he owned. This was the opening move in a plan that had been quietly forming for decades. A plan in which every glance, every rumor, and every scrap of indigo cloth would serve a purpose. 3 months after Celeste arrived at the Duval plantation, on a suffocating August night when the air hung thick as syrup and even the walls seemed to sweat, Sebastien Duval decided to host a dinner party that would become infamous in Louisiana's whispered history. The guest list contained only 4 names: Armand Lair, Octave Rousseau, Théophile Boudreau, and Judge Philippe, Sunnier, the wealthiest and most powerful men in the parish, and the 4 rivals who had been invited to bid on Celeste before she mysteriously escaped. These men controlled almost everything in that corner of Louisiana: the courts, the trade routes, the harvests, and the lives of hundreds of enslaved people. To be invited into Duval's home that night was an honor, but also a provocation. Everyone in the parish already gossiped about Duval's strange attachment to the woman in indigo. This dinner was a chance for his rivals to see her with their own eyes. The evening began with the usual plantation rituals. The men gathered in Duval's library, a room paneled in dark mahogany, decorated with maps and imported furniture, drinking French cognac and smoking Cuban cigars. They discussed crop prices, the growing tension in Washington, and the ever-present competition between sugar and cotton. But beneath their polite conversation was a thick undercurrent of curiosity. Not one of them cared about the politics or the weather. They had come to see her. Dinner was served at 8. Turtle soup, roasted duck, oysters prepared 3 different ways, and wine so expensive that most people in the parish would never taste them in their lifetimes filled the table. But despite the richness of the feast, the atmosphere was strained. Each man wondered whether Celeste would appear, and each quietly hoped she would not, unless the others were denied as well. Their pride, desire, envy, and unspoken rivalry simmered beneath the surface, disguised behind polite smiles and stiff posture. Duval said nothing about her throughout the meal, which only heightened the tension. He watched them with a private satisfaction, aware of the effect his silence was having. He had crafted this evening as carefully as a chess player setting a trap. It wasn't until dessert plates were being cleared that he finally moved. He rang a small silver bell. The dining room doors opened. Celeste entered wearing a dress of deep indigo blue, a color that in the wavering candlelight seemed to absorb all brightness and shimmer like something alive. The dress was modest, covering her from neck to wrist to ankle, yet the way she carried herself made the room fall silent, as though the air had been sucked out. She did not bow, she did not look down, and she did not move with the hesitation expected of an enslaved woman. Instead, she walked with a calm, measured grace, every step deliberate, every breath under her control. Her eyes, a strange golden shade, swept across the table. One witness would later say that in that moment she looked through each man as if she already knew the story of his life, his secrets, and his fate. Not one of the 5 men spoke. Not one of them breathed normally. Even Duval seemed slightly uneasy. Though he tried to hide it, Duval asked her to recite a short French verse. She spoke in a low, steady voice, her accent impossible to place educated, refined, nothing like the voice of someone who had spent her life in slavery. But it was not her poem that haunted the men. It was what she did afterward. She stood still for a moment, then slowly turned her gaze to each man in turn, letting her eyes rest just long enough to make them uncomfortable. It was not flirtation. It was not shyness. It was assessment, calculation, recognition. And then she smiled. Not sweetly, not coyly, but with the faintest curl of the lips that suggested she knew something none of them did. The scent of oleander, sweet smell with a bitter undercurrent, seemed to follow her as she left the room. And as soon as the door closed behind her, the spell broke. The men tried to resume conversation, but their voices were strained, their faces tight. They left shortly after midnight, each carrying with him a private, obsessive hunger he could neither explain nor control. Within a week, the letters began. Armand Lair offered Duval $8,000 for Celeste. Octave Rousseau countered with $10,000. Théophile Boudreau, impulsive and insecure in his newfound wealth, offered $12,000. And a rare breeding Mare worth another $2,000. But the most disturbing letter came from Judge Sunnier, a man known for icy discipline and unshakable logic. His message contained only one line. Name your price. I must have her. I cannot sleep. Duval rejected every offer. His refusals grew stranger, darker, almost taunting. He wrote long descriptions of her intelligence, her conversations, her ability to understand him better than his late wife ever did. This correspondence continued for 6 weeks. During that time, friendships soured, business partnerships fractured, and the parish began to feel off, as though a sickness had settled over the land. Then, on the morning of October 3rd, it ended. Servants found Sebastien Duval slumped over his desk in the study, pen in hand, eyes frozen wide in terror. In his other hand was a torn piece of indigo cloth. The letter he'd been writing ended abruptly. You must not pursue this further. She is not what you think. If you value your life and your soul, you will forget you ever saw. The sentence cut off mid-stroke. There were no wounds, no sign of poison, no evidence of struggle, but his face told a story the doctor refused to write down. Celeste was gone. Her cottage stood empty. Her clothing, her possessions vanished. Only a folded piece of indigo cloth on her pillow and the faint smell of oleander remained. 2 things were now certain. 1, Celeste had chosen her moment. 2, the first man had fallen. Asterisk, Sebastien Duval's death should have shaken the parish into caution, but instead it ignited something far more dangerous. When Judge Philippe Pissonnier arrived to oversee the investigation, he tried, at least at first, to act as a rational man of the law. But Sunnier was already compromised long before he stepped into Duval's study. He was the man who had written the most desperate letter, the man who confessed he would not know peace until Celeste belonged to him. As he stared at Duval's frozen eyes and the indigo cloth clenched in his stiffened hand, Sunnier felt not fear, but jealousy. Someone else had been close to her in those final moments. That thought alone poisoned the judge's reasoning. He officially declared Duval's death suspicious. Unofficially, he insisted that the search for Celeste be handled quietly. He claimed this was to protect the parish from scandal, but everyone close to him could see the truth. He didn't want anyone else to find her before he did. Slave patrols were dispatched, rewards were posted, and rumors spread through the delta like wildfire. Some believed Celeste had drowned in the swamps. Others whispered she had slipped away on a riverboat under disguise. But none of these theories mattered, because Sunnier had already begun a different kind of hunt, one conducted not with lanterns and horses, but with documents and old records. He began spending long nights in the courthouse, combing through files of property sales, shipment logs, and testimonials from previous estates across South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. And that was when the first pattern emerged. Celeste, though under different names, had appeared in 4 previous plantations. At each place, something catastrophic had happened. A wealthy man in Charleston who abruptly died of brain fever. 2 brothers in Savannah who killed one another in a duel whose cause no one remembered. A Virginia planter who lost his entire wealth in a single disastrous business deal and hanged himself days later. Sunnier should have recognized the warning. Any rational man would have stepped away. But Sunnier was no longer rational. He saw the pattern not as danger, but as destiny. He convinced himself he was different, that she would never harm him. His obsession grew into a fever. Weeks passed. The parish grew tense. Armand Lair stopped sleeping. Octave Rousseau became irritable and paranoid. Théophile Boudreau began having nightmares in which a woman stood beside dark, churning water. A heaviness settled over the land, and whispers spread through the slave quarters that the woman in blue was not running. She was circling. Then, on an early December morning, everything changed. A patrol spotted a tall woman with copper-colored skin walking calmly along the river road. She did not run when they approached. She did not speak. She simply lifted her hands and allowed them to escort her. Instead of taking her to the nearest plantation, the patrol brought her directly to Judge Sunnier because he had ordered it. She was locked in an overseer's cottage on Sunnier's property, but she was not treated like a prisoner. The guards were instructed not to harm her. That night, Sunnier himself brought food, wine, candles, and books. No one overheard their conversation, but people walking near the cottage later reported hearing a woman laughing softly. An unsettling, knowing laugh that seemed to linger in the cold December air. The next morning, Sunnier sent identical letters to Lair, Rousseau, and Boudreau, declaring the matter resolved. Celeste was in his possession and would remain there. He advised them to end their pursuit, clearly enjoying the power his letter carried. The replies he received were disturbing. Armand's letter was incoherent, a mixture of rage and pleading. Rousseau's reply was cold and hinted at legal retaliation. Boudreau's response was 10 pages long, filled with frantic declarations of love and strange descriptions of dreams in which Celeste stood in the river, calling his name for 3 weeks. Sunnier visited the cottage every evening. His wife fled the plantation in disgust, taking their children with her. Sunnier didn't seem to notice. He lost weight, grew pale, and began making irrational legal decisions in court. His colleagues whispered that he was no longer fit for the bench. But nothing stopped his nightly walks to the overseer's cottage. Then, on December 27, 1839, a house servant burst into the main house screaming for help. Sunnier had been found lying in the bed of the overseer's cottage dead. His eyes were wide, frozen with the same fear that had twisted Duval's face. In one hand was a piece of indigo cloth. On the pillow next to him lay another neatly folded piece. The doctor found no wounds, no clear poison, no struggle. But Beneath Sunnyer's fingernails and inside his mouth were traces of oleander leaves, one of the deadliest plants in the South. Celeste had vanished again. No footprints, no sign of a struggle. No witness saw her leave. The cottage smelled faintly of oleander, and the air felt strangely hollow, as if something had slipped out through cracks in the world, thought Judge. Sunnier's death should have been enough to terrify the remaining men into abandoning their pursuit. But obsession rarely loosens its grip. Instead of warning them away, his death intensified their compulsion. With two rivals gone, Armand Lear, Octave Rousseau, and Théophile Boudreau felt the prize drawing closer. What none of them understood was that they weren't hunting Celeste at all. She was hunting them, guiding them exactly where she wanted them to go in the weeks after Sunnier's death. The entire parish seemed to fall under a strange shadow. People whispered that the land felt wrong, wells tasted bitter, horses grew skittish at night, and plantation wives reported that their husbands were distracted, sleepless, and irritable. Celeste had vanished, yet her presence lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. Guards doubled their patrols. Servants murmured prayers at night. A quiet fear crept through the region. But still the three surviving men tried to convince themselves that they were in control. Armand Lair, terrified of becoming the next victim, rode across his fields every day with armed overseers beside him. He hired private search parties, paying them with money he secretly gathered by selling small pieces of land. Théophile Boudreau descended deeper into madness. He stopped attending church, stopped managing his plantation, and began riding the backwoods asking strangers if they had seen a copper-skinned woman with golden eyes. He slept only in short bursts, often waking screaming from dreams of dark water and a pair of unblinking eyes staring up at him. But the most dangerous pursuit belonged to Octave Rousseau, a man whose pride blinded him to fear. He hired a professional slave tracker from Mississippi, named Caleb Frost, a man notorious for finding runaways, even when they had vanished deep into swamps or disappeared across state lines. Frost reported 2 weeks into his search that a free woman of color in New Orleans claimed to have seen someone matching Celeste's description, living in a boarding house in a Cream neighborhood. Rousseau left immediately with money and legal documents giving him full authority to purchase any enslaved person he believed to be valuable property. 2 weeks later, Rousseau returned to his plantation with a woman he believed was Celeste. She matched the description, tall, copper-skinned, with the same unusual golden eyes. But to those who had seen Celeste before, she seemed different. Her posture was less still, her gaze less piercing, her movements more subdued. If she was trying to imitate Celeste, she had done a masterful job. But something essential, something almost impossible to name, was missing. Rousseau noticed none of this. He installed her not in the slave quarters, but in a finely furnished guest room inside the main house, a scandalous breach of plantation etiquette. He bought her expensive dresses, perfumes, jewelry, and dismissed his longtime housekeeper when she dared question his sanity. News of his find spread quickly. Armand Lair and Théophile Boudreau rode to his plantation, demanding to see her. Rousseau greeted them on his front porch with a loaded rifle and refused to let them step inside. Pointing the barrel at his old friends, he shouted the same words Sebastien Duval had once spoken. "She chose me." His voice cracked with desperation. He claimed he understood her in ways the others never could. He insisted that she needed to be treated not as property, but as a partner, an equal. The irony of a man owning over 300 enslaved people preaching equality was lost on him. But something in Rousseau's manic speech finally pierced the fog surrounding Lair and Boudreau. For the first time, they realized the truth. This woman, whoever she truly was not an object of desire, but a force of destruction. And they were next in her path. Driven by fear instead of lust, Lair and Boudreau began investigating her history in earnest. They traveled to New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah, and Richmond. They searched shipping records, bills of sale, and estate ledgers. Slowly, a deeply disturbing picture emerged. Celeste had been born in Saint Domingue, Haiti, around 1813, though her age may have been falsified on purpose. Her mother, Marguerite, had been a house servant who secretly learned to read and write, and who taught her daughter in secret. Celeste had then been sold repeatedly as she grew older, and each sale carried tragedy. In Virginia, she had lived on a plantation owned by a botanist who specialized in cultivating poisonous plants called nightshade, castor beans, hemlock, and oleander. Enslaved workers, including Celeste, tended the gardens daily, learning the subtle differences between medicinal doses and deadly ones. The botanist died of poisoning in 1827, an accident, according to estate records. His widow sold all the enslaved workers who worked in the poison gardens, writing that she could not bear to keep servants who know too much about death. The pieces fit with chilling precision. Celeste was a woman who had studied poison, disguise and the desires of men three weapons that, combined, made her nearly unstoppable. When Armand Laird discovered a shipping manifest proving that Celeste and her mother had once belonged to a French planter whose family later moved into Louisiana society, he rushed to Rousseau's plantation to warn him. Standing in the yard, he shouted the truth that the woman inside was a murderer, that every man who had ever possessed her had died violently or mysteriously, that she was not the treasure they believed her to be, but the architect of their doom. Rousseau responded by firing his rifle above Laird's head and having his overseers chase him off the property. That night, Rousseau sat down to dinner with the woman he believed was Celeste. She had insisted on cooking for him herself, an act he found touching, even romantic. They ate by candlelight, roasted chicken, potatoes with herbs, a salad of mixed greens and young leaves, fresh bread still warm from the oven. The food tasted bitter in places, but Rousseau barely noticed. He was too mesmerized by her presence that by morning. He was dead. He was found lying in his bed, eyes wide open in terror, a scrap of indigo fabric clenched in his hand. One of his servants later confessed she had seen the woman leave just before dawn, carrying a small traveling bag. The physician summoned by Judge Etienne Marchand was not fooled by vague explanations. He found crushed oleander leaves in the salad remnants and traces of toxic cardiac glycosides in Rousseau's stomach. The woman Rousseau had brought home had not been Celeste. She had been Celeste in disguise. She had allowed herself to be found, allowed herself to be purchased, and waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike. 3 men were dead. 2 remained, and Celeste was nowhere to be seen, but everywhere in their minds. Rousseau's death was the breaking point. For the first time, the men of St. Landry Parish could no longer pretend that these deaths were accidents or coincidences. The pattern was too precise, the timing too perfect, the presence of indigo cloth too deliberate. Judge Etienne Marchand, the new judge brought in from Natchitoches, refused to accept the easy explanations that had allowed Duval's and Sonier's deaths to fade into rumor. He understood immediately that this was not a matter of illness or misfortune. Someone was orchestrating these deaths with chilling patience and calculation, and all paths led back to the same woman. His first move was to protect the 2 remaining survivors of the dinner party, Armand Laird and Théophile Boudreau. Laird accepted the offer without hesitation. Terrified, sleepless, and jumpy at every sound, he packed a trunk and moved into a guarded room at a hotel in Opelousas. He barely ate. He trusted no one. His guards rotated every 4 hours because he feared that if any single guard stood watch, for too long Celeste would find a way to seduce or bribe them. His hands shook constantly. He refused to sleep unless his back was pressed to the wall, but Théophile Boudreau refused protection. The youngest of the group, he had always been the most impulsive. Now, after nearly a year and a half of living under the shadow of Celeste's presence, he had descended into a mental collapse that horrified even his relatives. He didn't bathe. He didn't eat unless forced. He spent his days riding alone through his plantation grounds, talking to voices no one else heard. His eyes were hollow, sunken, always scanning the horizon like someone waiting for a storm. When Judge Marchand rode out to Boudreaux's plantation and insisted he come under protective custody, Theophile met him on the porch barefoot, unshaven, and trembling. What he said next chilled the judge to the bone. "You don't understand," Theophile whispered. "She's not coming to kill me. She's coming to free me." Marchand demanded to know what he meant. What truth did he believe he needed to confess? The young planter only smiled, an empty, broken smile, and said, "Ask her about the plantation in Saint-Domingue. Ask her about 1804, about the fire, about the woman and child thrown into the sea. Ask her why she's doing this." Then he turned, walked back into his house, and locked the door. Marchand rode back to his office deeply shaken. Something about Theophile's words, especially the mention of Saint-Domingue. He began digging through old shipping manifests, immigration records, and plantation registers. And slowly, piece by piece, the horrifying truth emerged. In 1804. During the chaos of the Haitian Revolution, a French planter named Gaspard Boudreaux attempted to flee the island with what remained of his wealth. According to a ship's manifest, he boarded a vessel with one of his sons just 4 years old and a small group of enslaved people he considered valuable property. Among them were a woman identified as Marguerite and a child, age 5, listed only as property of Boudreaux estate. But an elderly aunt of Theophile, one of the last surviving family members who had been on that voyage as a child, revealed the truth Marchand needed. She remembered Marguerite. She remembered the child. She remembered the fire that consumed the plantation as they fled. She remembered that Marguerite had been branded for trying to escape. The wound became infected. Gaspard Boudreaux declared that she would die anyway, and that her daughter would grow troublesome, just like her mother died, so he ordered both mother and child thrown overboard into the Gulf of Mexico. He told the crew they had died of fever. The enslaved people aboard the ship knew the truth, but no one would believe them. Marchand stared at the documents with a growing sense of horror. If the child was 5 years old in 1804, she would have been in her 40s by 1839. But Celeste had been listed as 26 in her most recent sale. Fake ages were common in the slave trade, especially for women who were considered valuable. It was entirely possible that Celeste was far older than she appeared. It was entirely possible that Celeste had been that child. And so she had survived being thrown into the sea, rescued by another ship, washed ashore, hidden by someone who recognized her value. However, she escaped death. One thing was now clear. She had spent more than 3 decades planning her revenge. Every man who had profited from her mother's death. Every man who had watched that crime in silence. Every man tied to the Boudreaux plantation in Saint-Domingue. They were all on her list. Marchand sent deputies to retrieve Theophile Boudreaux by force. They arrived at his plantation on the night of February 14th, 1840. The front door was open. A trail of small, torn pieces of indigo cloth led through the hallway, across the parlor, and into the study. And there, seated at his father's old desk, they found Theophile Boudreaux. He was dead. His eyes were wide open, just like Duval's and Sonier's. A piece of indigo cloth was clenched in his hand. On the desk in front of him was a letter addressed to Celeste. The deputies read it and immediately understood its significance. It was both a confession and a surrender. Theophile wrote that he remembered the night on the ship. He remembered standing beside his father as Marguerite and her child were thrown into the sea. He remembered the sound of the little girl screaming for help. He remembered her mother trying to keep her afloat. He remembered Gaspard Boudreaux laughing, saying the sharks would take them. "I have lived with this image for 34 years, Theophile wrote. "Every night I see her face in the dark water. When I saw you at Duval's dinner, I knew who you were. I welcome what you came to do. I deserve it." Next to the letter sat a cup of tea, the liquid still warm. Floating on the surface were small leaves, later identified as oleander. Theophile had taken his own life. But the servants confirmed what the deputies already suspected. Celeste had visited him earlier that afternoon. They saw her enter with a small basket. They saw her leave an hour later. After she left, the house had gone eerily silent. Inside, the basket. The deputies found fresh oleander cuttings and a small book of French poetry. 4 men were now dead. One remained, and Armand. Lair, hiding in a guarded hotel room, was about to learn that all the locks in the world cannot stop a woman who has mastered patience. Poison and disguise. Armand Lair had always believed himself to be the most cautious, the most disciplined, the most intelligent of the 5 men who dined to Belle's table. Now, with 4 of them dead, his pride collapsed under the weight of terror. For 43 days he lived inside a hotel room in Opelousas that had effectively become a prison. 2 guards stood outside his door at all times. He checked every lock himself. He refused to eat anything unless he had watched it cooked from raw ingredients. He paced the room endlessly, jumping at every footstep in the hallway. Convinced Celeste was near even when she was nowhere to be seen, he slept in short, violent bursts, waking from nightmares drenched in sweat. His health declined rapidly. His face turned sallow, his hands trembled uncontrollably, and he drank heavily to numb the fear. Judge Marchand visited him often, trying to calm him, but nothing helped. Lair insisted that Celeste could slip through walls, poison the air, or disguise herself as anyone. He truly believed she was not human anymore, but something born from the sins of Saint-Domingue, something the Boudreau family had brought across the Gulf. Marchand dismissed the supernatural theories. Celeste, he believed, was flesh and blood but, armed with knowledge, discipline, and the slow patience of someone who had waited decades for justice. Her skill with poisons, her ability to disguise herself, her intelligence, these made her dangerous, not magic. But even the judge could not deny one thing. She was always one step ahead. The search for her grew desperate. Circulars with her. Descriptions were sent to every parish in Louisiana, every county in Mississippi, Alabama, and East Texas. River pilots were questioned. Steamboats searched. Rewards totaling $10,000 offered for her capture. And yet, nothing. Not a single confirmed sighting. It began to feel as if she had dissolved into the landscape, hidden in plain sight among thousands of enslaved women whose faces white men never bothered to remember. Then, on March 28th, everything changed. Lair received a letter. The envelope was sealed with dark indigo wax. His name was written in elegant, flowing handwriting. The moment he saw it, his hands began shaking so violently that he could barely break the seal. Judge Marchand was summoned at once. Together they read the letter. It was from Celeste. She reminded him of the night in 1804, the night his 14-year-old self had stood on the deck of a ship while Gaspard Boudreau threw a woman and her child into the sea. She reminded him that he did nothing, that he watched, that he was old enough to know right from wrong. She reminded him of the families he had destroyed on his plantation, the children he had sold, the lives he had profited from. You believed you were a good master. You believed yourself a Christian. But you never questioned the evil you benefited from. Then came the sentence that made Armand Lair collapse onto the bed in terror. By the time you read this letter, I am already inside the hotel. Celeste explained that she had been there for 3 days, watching him, studying him, waiting for the right moment. His guards never noticed her because they were looking for a beautiful enslaved woman, young, elegant, exotic. But Celeste told him the simple truth. They do not look at older women. They do not look at plain women. They do not look at women they believe beneath their notice. They do not look at the chambermaid who changes your sheets. Her final message struck like a blade. Tonight you will drink your brandy. Tomorrow they will find you. And I will move on to the next name on my list. The letter was unsigned. Marchand turned the hotel upside down. Every room was searched. Every guest questioned. Every employee interrogated. Nothing. No trace of a copper-skinned woman with golden eyes. Then the judge questioned the CAAMB RMAIDS. Two were older women known to the hotel for years. The third was relatively new, hired 3 months earlier. Her name was Louise Benoit, a nearly 40-year-old, free woman of color, heavy-set, slightly pockmarked, quiet, polite. invisible. Marchand questioned her carefully. Her papers were perfect references. Work history, residency verification. She answered every question calmly. She had never heard of Celeste. She had never met the five men. Everything about her seemed ordinary, except her eyes. Beneath the disguise of age, weight, and scars, there flickered a glint of gold, the same golden shade every man who had ever seen. Celeste had described. Marchand ordered her arrested on suspicion alone. But Louise Benoit did not resist. She simply smiled with mild amusement, as if she'd expected this from the beginning. Nothing incriminating was found on her, no poison, no indigo cloth, nothing tying her directly to any murder. Marchand locked her in a courthouse room while he prepared charges. Meanwhile, Armand Lair, relieved that she was finally captured, allowed himself to relax. He ate a proper dinner for the first time in weeks. He drank his evening brandy. He slept. The next morning, the guards unlocked his door and found him dead, eyes wide open, a piece of indigo cloth clutched in his hand. Louise Benoit sat in her cell smiling as they told her the news. Judge Marchand stormed in, demanding answers. How? He shouted. You were locked up all night. How did you kill him? Louise tilted her head. The question, Judge, is not who killed him. The question is when the poison entered his body. And then she explained the truth. For 43 days, she had tended Armand Lair's fire every evening. She brought firewood to his room, firewood he believed came from oak or pecan. But it wasn't it was oleander wood, dried carefully so it would burn slowly. Every night for 43 nights, Lair breathed in that toxic smoke, tiny doses, accumulating in his blood, until the final, fatal threshold was reached. By the time he drank his brandy that night, he was already dead. Louise Benoit, Celeste in disguise, had killed him weeks before she was ever arrested. And now, with all five men dead, there was nothing left for her to do. She had completed her revenge. Armand Lair's death should have been the final proof the court needed. 5 men dead, all in the same horrific manner, all touched by the same indigo cloth. But Judge Marchand discovered something far more terrifying than poison or disguise. The law was powerless against a woman like Celeste, not because she was supernatural, but because she understood the legal system better than the men who built it. Louise Benoit Celeste's final disguise was placed on trial within days. The courthouse in Opelousas was packed with spectators, plantation owners eager to see justice served, nervous wives holding handkerchiefs to their faces, and free people of color standing quietly at the back, watching with eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. Everyone expected the trial to be short. 5 dead men, 1 woman present at each turning point. A pattern of poison and indigo cloth, surely she would hang, but Celeste, seated calmly in the defendant's chair with her hands folded neatly in her lap, knew something no one else had considered. The law in Louisiana refused to believe a woman, especially a black woman, capable of such brilliance. The prosecution presented its case. They described the deaths, the pattern, the pieces of indigo cloth. They described her movements, her disguises, the testimony of servants, and the sequence of events that followed each man's downfall. Judge Marchand spoke passionately about her knowledge of toxic plants, her training under the Virginia botanist, 30 years of careful planning. He explained how oleander smoke could poison a man slowly over weeks without detection. He described the accidental deaths at previous plantations, the duels, the bankruptcies, the suicides, and Celeste listened silently, almost respectfully, as though she were attending the lecture of a particularly earnest schoolteacher. Then the defense rose. They said simply, "Where's the proof? Where were the poison plates? Where was the oleander? Where were the witnesses who saw her harm anyone? Where was the evidence she was even the same woman from Charleston, Savannah, Virginia, and Haiti? Where was the proof that a heavy-set chambermaid of 40 could transform into a woman half her age? Where was any object tying Louise Benoit to these crimes?" The defense didn't need to prove her innocence. They only needed to sow doubt. And doubt they sowed expertly. The prosecution had no physical evidence. No murder weapon. No eyewitness. Nothing except patterns and possibilities. And, importantly, the racial beliefs of 1840 worked in her favor. White men could not believe that a black woman, enslaved or free, was capable of such precise, intelligent, methodical execution of revenge across decades. The jury all white. All male whispered among themselves. Many looked uncomfortable. Some openly scoffed at Marchand's theory. A black woman, maintaining multiple identities, manipulating wealthy white men, planning deaths across states and decades, mastering poison, outsmarting judges, planters, and slave hunters. Impossible. Or so they told themselves. After 3 days of testimony, the jury returned. The verdict: not guilty. A gasp swept through the courthouse. Some shouted in outrage. Others broke into nervous whispers. But Celeste did not smile. She did not cry. She simply stood, adjusted her shawl, thanked the judge for his fairness, and walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight dot and disappeared. Not into the swamps. Not in a river. Not into a slave market. She vanished into the world, quietly, deliberately, confidently, for years afterward. Rumors flickered across the country. A woman with golden eyes teaching school for free. Black children in Philadelphia in the 1850s. A copper-skinned woman helping enslaved families escape to Canada in the 1860s. A mysterious woman with a French accent living as an artist in Paris in the 1870s. None of these sightings could be confirmed. And perhaps that was exactly how she wanted it. Judge Marchand continued investigating long after the trial. He traveled to Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, piecing together every step of her life. What he discovered was astonishing. At least 17 men connected to the Boudreaux plantation in Saint-Domingue had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 15 years. Some suddenly, some slowly, some ruined before they fell. Each death marked by a small scrap of indigo cloth and the faint scent of oleander dot. She had not killed for pleasure. She had not killed randomly. She had killed with purpose, with memory, with patience, with a justice denied to her by every court in America. Years later, Marchand received one final letter postmarked Boston, 1865, the year slavery ended. Celeste wrote that she had followed his career, had seen him advocate for reform, had watched him become a fairer man, perhaps seeing what justice becomes when it is denied. Made you understand why I did what I did. She said her work was complete. She said she hoped her mother could rest. She said she did not expect forgiveness. She signed nothing dot, and Judge Marchand kept that letter hidden. For the rest of his life, locked in a drawer, the ink fading, but the truth unmistakable, because he finally understood some justice is not written in laws. Some justice is written in memory and patience. And sometimes revenge is the only justice the oppressed are ever given. After the trial and her silent disappearance from Louisiana, Celeste's story should have faded like countless buried tragedies of the American South. But instead, it transformed into a whisper carried across plantation quarters, secret meetings, church gatherings, and later, the freed communities forming after emancipation. In the decades that followed, her name became a symbol of fear among those who upheld slavery and of quiet, powerful hope among those who had suffered under it. Judge Marchand, unable to rest without understanding the full truth, continued tracing her steps through official records and hidden testimonies. What he discovered formed a chilling mosaic of carefully orchestrated vengeance. At least 17 men across multiple states, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, had died in unsettlingly similar ways. Sudden heart failure, undetectable poisons, strange accidents, financial ruin, followed by suicide. Some deaths had been dismissed as misfortune, others as divine punishment. But the indigo cloth found with each body revealed the truth. These were not accidents. They were the final chapters of a story that began in black waters of the Gulf of Mexico in 1804, when a woman and her child were thrown overboard. Every death was a message. You are not forgotten. You are not forgiven. Despite his best efforts, Marchand never located Celeste. He followed rumors from Charleston to Philadelphia, from New Orleans to Canada, tracing faint ghost-like shadows of a woman who always seemed to stay one step ahead of the world, trying to categorize or capture her. Some said she educated freed black children in the North. Others said she worked for the Underground Railroad, helping families escape to new lives far from the reach of men like those she had hunted. One story claimed she lived quietly in Paris in the 1870s, painting flowers and reading poetry. None of these sightings could be confirmed, yet each carried the same recurring detail: an older woman with golden eyes who spoke little but observed everything. Whether these sightings were true did not matter. What mattered was what she represented: a woman who refused to die the day she was thrown into the sea, who refused to let her mother's murder vanish into the fog of forgotten history, who refused to let enslavers believe their crimes would be unpunished simply because the law supported them. Louisiana officials sealed and later destroyed every document related to the deaths of the 5 wealthy planters from 1839 to 1840. The official reason was to prevent unrest, but everyone who knew the truth understood the real purpose. These documents revealed a secret that white authorities could never allow the world to see: that their power was not absolute, that their wealth was built on horrors that could return to claim them, that a single enslaved woman had brought down 5 pillars of Southern aristocracy without raising her voice or a weapon. The erasure of Celeste's story was an act of self-preservation for a society built on cruelty. To admit her existence was to admit vulnerability, yet the slave quarters remembered. They whispered her name during long nights, telling children about the woman who carried her mother's indigo cloth as a banner of justice. They told stories of her patience, her intelligence, her mastery of disguise, her refusal to break, her ability to turn the master's deepest vice desire into a noose around his own neck. She became a legend not of supernatural vengeance, but of human endurance. A reminder that even the most powerless person can gather strength across years, across trauma, across silence. The last surviving document in the entire case was the letter Celeste, sent to Judge Marchand in 1865. In it, she explained that she never sought to be monster only to balance a scale that had been tipped against her since childhood. I was never a demon, Judge. I was simply a woman who refused to forget. She spoke of the moment her mother drowned, of the cold black water, of the laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. She wrote that every piece of indigo cloth she left behind was not a trophy, but a eulogy, one for her mother and for every enslaved woman whose suffering went unspoken. She ended her letter with a single haunting line: "Remember me not as the terror they feared, but as the justice they tried to deny." Marchand kept that letter locked in his desk until his death, reading it during sleepless nights, wondering if justice and revenge were truly separate at all, or if, under a system that denied certain people any legal path to justice, revenge became the only justice they could ever claim. After his death, his grandson found the letter and preserved it, refusing to let the story die the way Louisiana authorities intended. And so the story of Celeste, once erased, once feared, once whispered behind closed doors, survived because it carried a truth too heavy to destroy. Every system built on suffering eventually creates someone who will dismantle it one life at a time. Her legend remains a testament to the terrible patience of the oppressed, the long memory of the wronged, and the inevitability of reckoning when justice is allowed to thrive unchecked. The men from Duval's dinner table all died within 7 months, their plantations scattered, their families broken, their legacies erased. But the woman they tried to possess, she lived. She chose her own ending. And somewhere, perhaps in a northern classroom, perhaps in a quiet Parisian studio, perhaps in a town where no one knew her past, she carried the memory of her mother with her, knowing at last that the sea that tried to claim her had failed. She had risen from those waters not as a victim, but as a force that history tried desperately, but unsuccessfully, to silence.